Hi, my name is Jonathan Lewis. I'm the Assistant Secretary for Pastoral Ministry and Social Concerns for the Archdiocese of Washington in DC, and it's a privilege to be with you. I'm grateful to Archbishop Gustavo for the invitation, for he and his staff putting this together, and the opportunity to be with you online, though I wish I was enjoying the warmer Texas weather with you. I work in Washington, DC, and serve in a number of offices, supporting our parish life in evangelization, youth, young adult ministries, family ministry, and so on. And today I'm excited to talk with you about the topic of radical hospitality. So to start, I wanted to share a personal story. Though I live in Washington, D.C., I'm not an East Coaster by birth. I am originally from Kansas. I grew up on a farm in Kansas City area. And as the country song says, everyone's famous in a small town. And so I had the opportunity very early on to really experience a positive experience of parish life, where I was welcomed. I was Ed Lewis's son. When your grandfather helps build the church you grew up in, kind of everyone knows you. You can't hide anywhere, even if you wanted to. I'm the youngest of three brothers, and so that legacy of being the little Lewis in the family followed me. From my parish life into my grade school and high school life. And that warm environment really helped me to stay engaged and become engaged in my faith as a lifelong Catholic. As an adult, it's been a different experience of being active in my faith. I'm been married 4 years, and my wife and I moved just over a year ago and to a new place and had opportunity to get to know new parishes. And so, like many young adult Catholics, we took the chance to get to know not only the parish that's nearest to us, but the 2 or 3 that are also very close, and parish hopping back and forth. And the challenge that we had, I think, is so similar to the challenge that Catholics across the country have, even people of various ages. We parish hopped, going to Mass every Sunday at different places at those 3 parishes, more or less, for months. And even though we were somewhat consistent in those 3 parishes, over the course of about 6 months, no one had gotten to know us by name. And sadly, we hadn't had the chance to get to know others by name. We walked in, sat by ourselves with our infant daughter. Some people waved and were very friendly with a smile, but no one broke the ice to make us feel as though we were at home in that parish and belonged. Now, more recently, we've taken the initiative to do that, but it was a striking example of the need for us always to have an attentiveness to how we're welcoming people, not only by saying hello, but by really getting to know people by name and building a relationship. I had one pastor here in the DC area, when I was talking with them, especially about young people joining the church, he said to me, if I were a young person, I wouldn't want to go to church here. And that sort of took me back that if the pastor was saying that, what was the experience of people in the pews? And what's the experience of people who hadn't even made it to the pews yet? And so I think the question for us today is, and this topic of radical hospitality, how to stop trying to be cool and stop being warm, is how do we cultivate parish communities that are warm, that radically welcome people? How do we do that in the parish? But then also, what role do we as just practicing Catholics have to play in cultivating warm hospitality? The world, as you know, but maybe less in Texas and other places, is more in need of warmth today than ever before. The coronavirus has sort of frozen so many of our social relationships. People have been homebound or feel more isolated or scared of engaging in social interaction. While many places may be opening up, those who have pre-existing conditions or are medically vulnerable still don't have that privilege of going out and engaging people. So sometimes the people most in need still feel trapped or isolated. And we know that this reality of COVID also strikes at an interesting time in American life. 28% of Americans live at home by themselves today. More people live by themselves than ever before in US history. And so we see people who are already, although digitally connected to one another on Facebook or social media, are living more and more alone. And as a result, feeling more and more alone. Almost a quarter of millennials, those kind of in their 20s and 30s now, say they have almost no friends. And so people really feel this deep crisis. There's no wonder we have a mental health crisis in this country, as many people are contemplating suicide or experiencing depression. People are lonely, people are hurting, and people are more and more isolated. The good news in this time is that almost half of Americans say they're interested or have begun a new spiritual and religious practice during COVID. So there certainly is this spiritual hunger that we can never escape, right? As St. Augustine said, "You have made us for yourself, O God, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you." We always have in the church this great experience of a hunger for God that every human soul has, and we have to fill one way or the other. The challenge is with those almost 50% who say they're searching for a new religious or spiritual practice, about half of those people say they don't have anyone to talk to. Even those who have watched online church don't know how to take that next step into belonging into the life of a parish community. Half people say they have no one to talk to about their faith. And so this should be sort of a crisis point for us in the life of the church to say, we don't want to be those parishes where someone says, I wouldn't want to belong here. We want to be those rich, warm, inviting places where people feel as though they have a home. So what is working? When you ask young people who stay in church, which is a great metric of people who are really engaged in what's working, a third of young people who stay engaged in their parishes say that what they're looking for is a church that's warm. They want a church that's warm, not necessarily just a church that's cool. And when we talk with young people, one word we hear over and over again is spiritual home. People are looking to feel as though they belong in a home. And so today, I invite you to think about not only your church and your particular parish, especially from the point of view of a newcomer, which I want you to do, but also to think about the best qualities of home. Maybe it's not always mirrored in the home you grew up in or the home you have now, but think about those beautiful qualities of what it means to be in a home. A home is a place that's warm, where the lights are on, where people know you by name, where you're always welcome, where you're celebrated, where you're fed, where you can take a rest, where you're cared for. It's a place where you get to heal when you're sick or when you're hurting. It's a place you can be yourself. It's a place you don't have to win other people's attention. You're already loved. You don't have to earn that love, right? Those are the qualities of community life that we want to cultivate within each of our parish communities. So to start, just want to give you a little bit to think about your own parish life. What do you experience in your parish? Or if you think about it from the perspective of a newcomer, is your parish warm or is it cold? Maybe on a sliding scale, you could think, is it hot and warm, ready to welcome people? Is it more like room temperature? Or is it a little icy or a little cold? Especially for people who maybe, like me and my wife, might be coming for the first time and don't know anyone yet. That's a question I want us to think through today. The good news is that this is not a talk only for the archbishop or the pastor or parish staffs, but that every baptized person has an important and key role to play in cultivating warmth in the life of a parish community. So I think our question today is, how do we do that, both in person and increasingly online, as people may be more reticent to step foot in our church doors today or in the coming months than they would have a year ago. I'm grateful for Archbishop Gustavo, who gave us sort of this mission dead on in the first paragraph of the document, his pastoral letter, Transformed by Hope, Let Us Rebuild Our Tomorrow. Archbishop says, ignited by the Holy Spirit who dwells in our hearts, let us dive into the dynamics of the current times. Let us come in closer spiritual contact with God and with one another. Let us recognize and caress the face of the Lord whom we adore in the flesh of every suffering brother or sister. So Archbishop is calling us to a spiritual and real practical closeness to the people of God, especially during this time. That missionary mandate to go make disciples rings true today. And we're called to be a hospitable church and to welcome others because of that missionary mandate, because this is exactly what Jesus asked of us. Our salvation is contingent upon it, in fact. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus says, when I was hungry, you gave me something to eat. When I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. And when I was a stranger, you welcomed me. It's essential. It's built into the gospel message. St. Paul says, don't neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for by this some have entertained angels without knowing that, from the book of Hebrews. And so we see from what Archbishop Gustavo said and St. Paul, that hospitality gives us an opportunity to encounter the face of Christ in one another. And we'll see, I think, as we move on, that doing so doesn't just benefit the other person, as though we ourselves are content and want to help those most in need. Entering into a relationship with hospitality offers each of us, those who receive hospitality and those who give, the chance to grow in holiness and to grow closer to one another. One of the great icons of hospitality in the lives of the saints is Saint Benedict, the founder of the monastic life of the church. And he said in his rule to all the brothers, all guests are to be welcomed as Christ, for he himself will say, I was a stranger and you welcomed me. Mother Teresa herself said, today, if we have no peace, it's because we've forgotten that we belong to each other. And I love that line. Pope Francis, in his document Fratelli Tutti, talks about the need for us to cultivate this spirit of kinship, that we belong to one another as a human family. And that document would make for a beautiful reflection, not only in the need of hospitality in our global world, but in our families and communities as well. And we know that we're in a period in our church, as Jesus calls us, to go out, where we can't just stay inside of our church. Hospitality isn't just keeping a door open and waiting for people to come in. We have to go out to encounter people where he are. That's the missionary mandate, right? Jesus says, go make disciples of all nations. In fact, the church is one of those peculiar organizations whose whole mission isn't for the people who are inside. It's for the people who are outside. We're called to have a missionary mindset, to always be going out to encounter those most in need. And so building warm communities to welcome those people who come back is so important because of this key principle that belonging and feeling at home in the life of the church is the key factor that leads to lifelong belief and practice of faith. People used to think that knowledge of faith was enough, that if people believed what the church taught, if you could memorize the catechism, then that'd be it. It's a mental exercise, check the box, and you're done. You'll be Catholic for the rest of your life. What we're seeing is that's not true, that believing doesn't necessarily lead to lifelong practice of faith, lifelong belonging. I think we see this in people who have been through Catholic schools or our religious education programs or RCIA, that knowing about the church isn't enough to being engaged in the life of the church, right? Even the devil knows plenty about Jesus. It's not knowledge that's the goal of life, it's friendship with Christ that we encounter most fully in the life of a Christian community. And so I think we have to focus on first, how do we cultivate communities of belonging? Not as an end in itself. We're not just looking for fancy Christian clubs, but because belonging and Christian friendship is the key driver for helping people who are especially isolated or lonely practice their faith through the course of their lives. And some of these qualities of belonging, I want to build on a book called Growing an Engaged Church that talks about this beautifully. It describes that belonging is when people have a friend at their church, especially a close friend. It's when a person who has an opportunity to use their gifts, when leaders know me by name, when leaders care about me as a person, when people notice if I'm not there, when someone has talked to me about the progress of my spiritual life and my spiritual growth, when people can say yes to those questions, that they have a friend, that they're missed if they're not there, that people check up on them one-on-one. Those are the qualities of a person who belong. And so again, as we look at our parishes with a bit more of an objective view, I think we can maybe recognize that it's a very small percentage of people who belong in this type of way. In fact, most people who talk about missionary life and evangelization say that it's about 10% of the church that are really actively engaged in the life of the parish, who are intentional about their journey of Christian discipleship and growth in holiness. And that means that even though some of our churches can fit 1,000 people or might be very big, the people who are most engaged or feel as though they have a home in our church might be much smaller than we think. And one of the challenges is a lot of those people who feel as though they belong, those 10%, are probably people like you and me that work for the church, that are actively volunteering, that are passionate for our relationship with the Lord. But we have to remember that we're not the norm in this situation, that most people, in fact, the vast majority of people don't feel at home in the life of our parishes. And to not take that as a personal affront or indictment, but just as an opportunity for us to widen the net of walking with people as Jesus did. And when I think about my own story, we talk about all those qualities of belonging. That's my story. Even though I grew up in a small church, I was able in that environment to be known. In fact, I think small churches have a little bit of a leg up on bigger churches in terms of belonging. But I also had youth ministers who got to know me by name and walked with me in my spiritual life. I had a high school chaplain who got to know me by name and mentored me. In college, I had a spiritual director who walked with me on a regular basis. They were people who always drew me in closer to the heart of Christ, in the heart of the Christian community and the heart of the church. So take a moment to think about your own Christian journey, both now and maybe even during some of those key transitions of life, after college, emerging adulthood, and in and out of married life, having your first kids. Were there people there who helped you feel as though you belonged in the life of the church? Are there spiritual mentors and guides that walked with you in your journey of faith? And I think as we think about the names of those people, one, it fills us with great warmth to think about maybe some of those, as Pope Francis says, the middle-class saints who walked with us, who were great role models and lived just a life of love and generosity. But also to think of how grateful we should be and how many people are hungry for those types of relationships that we've had the opportunity to know. Another sort of way of assessing this for ourselves is to think about how many friends do you have at church? Studies show that for a person to really become active and engaged and belonging in their parish, they need to have about 5 friends. And so I ask you, do you have 5 people who you know by name, who you're close with, who you communicate with regularly? Again, probably about 90% of our parishes don't have those 5 people. And in a recent study in a book by Kara Powell called Growing Young, and a book by Kara Powell also called Sticky Faith, they talk about the thing that makes faith stick, especially for young people, but I think it's true for elders in our church as well, is the presence of small community and belonging. And so her study shows that for young people to stay engaged in life of the church, they need 5 people who walk with them, friends, mentors, and spiritual guides. And so this is part of this ministry of hospitality. It's not just 5 people who form a committee in the corner of the church. It's about a vision and culture of church life that welcome people in every place and in every stage. And so we've got to figure out pathways of discipleship. So when people get connected to the church, it's easy for them to build and to sort of catch friendships along the way. Again, not because we just want to be a social club, but because we recognize that Christ gave us Christian community as the way to live faith together, to be a Eucharistic family. One kind of funny example of this, Father James Mallon, the author of the book Divine Renovation, talks about whether or not maybe we feel too comfortable in our churches, if those 10% maybe talk to each other all the time or kind of feel as though there's a bit of a clique in our churches. And one thing he says is that if you don't feel comfortable taking your bag with you, your purse with you at communion, then maybe we're a little too comfortable with the people we're around us in church. So his point, though maybe we should trust people to not necessarily have to pick up our purse up to the communion line, his point is if we know everyone and we feel comfortable that we're not doing a good enough job being missional and being initiators of this radical hospitality. We should feel a little bit of maybe not anxiety, but at least wonder of who the people around us are, both as an opportunity to encounter them, but maybe to remind us that the church isn't just the club or the small group of people that we know. And so I thought that's kind of a funny but meaningful measure is, do you know all the people sitting around you so much that you just feel comfortable leaving your purse right there? Or maybe as an opportunity for us to welcome the stranger and to reach out to engage more people as well. And to say that the process of hospitality, this journey of finding these at least 5 friends and belonging in the life of the parish, isn't a one-time deal. It's not a one-time hospitality fair. It's not a one-time ministry fair. It's, again, this vision of church life that includes those things, may include those things, but has to extend beyond it. It's the long-term spiritual accompaniment of people in the life of our parishes. So I want to share 10 qualities of hospitality from the stories of saints in our church, and then offer 10 practical recommendations or ideas to consider for your particular parish. Again, hospitality is not a one-size-fits-all. It changes based upon language and culture of the people we're trying to reach out to and serve. But there are some core pillars and principles that I think can stick with us and hopefully cultivate a sense of discernment with you and your leadership team at the parish. So first, 10 qualities of hospitality. The first, hospitality always helps us to find Christ. In the Gospel of Luke, chapter 24, we hear the Road to Emmaus story, where Christ, after the resurrection, is made known to these 2 disciples as they walk away. They're leaving the church, going the wrong direction. And it's only when the 2 disciples who are walking with Jesus, though they don't recognize him, offer Jesus hospitality, say, no, please don't go further. Come and stay with us for the night. It's in that invitation of welcoming the stranger that Christ has made known to them over that meal in the breaking of the bread. And those 2, with their hearts burning within them, return back to the 12 apostles to tell of what has been their experience. And so we see that it's in giving that we receive, like the gospel tells us, and this is a very practical example, that Christian hospitality always benefits both of us and helps us find Christ. Secondly, Christian hospitality is fruitful for all of us. In the book of Genesis, chapter 18, we hear the story of Abraham and Sarah receiving visitors. And after he welcomed and offered hospitality to these 3 strangers, One of them prophetically says, "I will return to you this time next year, and Sarah will then have a son." And they found this hilarious because of their old age, but yet it was true. It was because Abraham opens himself up to the Lord and to the stranger that they received the gift of this child. And so God works by when we open our hearts to him in our neighbor, especially those most in need. And that hospitality isn't just a one-way street as though we have all the riches and resources and we share them with those who are less fortunate. It's not a giveaway. It's building a relationship that's always in two directions. Third, hospitality is a ministry of healing. The word hospitality comes from the same root word as hospital, which means healing. And so hospitality is meant to be a space where we heal and where we grow closer to one another. And I love the quote from Pope Benedict XVI in his first document encyclical as Pope, God is Love, where he says that love of neighbor is shown to be possible in the way proclaimed by Jesus. And it consists in the fact that in God, with God, I love even the person whom I don't even like or even know. It can only take place on the basis of an intimate encounter with God. Then I learn to look on this other person, not simply with my eyes and my feelings, but from the perspective of Jesus Christ. His friend is my friend. Seeing with the eyes of Christ, I can give to others much more than their outward necessities. I can give them the look of love which they crave. Pope Benedict speaks so directly to this hunger and loneliness that people are experiencing. And that, yes, this ministry of hospitality might provide very practical resources that people are in need of, but it also always provides this look of love, this personal relationship that is always healing when we connect people to Christ the healer. Fourth, hospitality is joyful. We see this in the example of St. Philip Neri, called the Apostle of Joy, who ministered to Rome and was sort of very clownish in the way he engaged people as a way of growing in humility himself. And we see this, I think, in a contemporary apostle of joy in our Holy Father, Pope Francis. The major document he wrote on evangelization is called The Joy of the Gospel. And Francis says, the Christian ID card is joy. The gospel's joy, the joy of having been chosen by Jesus, saved by Jesus, regenerated by Jesus. The joy of that hope that Jesus is waiting for us. The joy that even with the crosses and sufferings we bear, that Jesus accompanies us and is with us. And so opening up hospitality is a way of sharing the joy of the gospel in ordinary life. And I think we know, for those of us who've had the privilege of walking with other people, that when we give the joy of the gospel, we always receive it in measure as well. Fifth, hospitality is steady and consistent. My wife and I had a child 2 years ago, not quite 2 years ago, Esther, and walking with my wife during pregnancy and learning as a first-time dad all of the vulnerabilities of that process really had taught me a lot about this ministry of hospitality, that it's a slow process of childbirth. It's a slow process of carrying a child for 9 months. But it teaches us that hospitality is not a quick one-time thing. And I think the experience of women and mothers gives us a great insight into that as well. I think particularly of the saints Louis and Zélie Martin, the parents of Saint Therese of Lisieux, who cared and accompanied their children, who cultivated a rich, warm family life where they passed on the faith. Many of their daughters entered religious life, including Saint Therese, and they planted the seeds of faith within the hearts of their children to bear fruit in eternal life and for the universal church. And so that wasn't a one-time act. Parenting is often described as a ministry of hospitality. Children are gifts that do not belong to us. We don't control them. We welcome them, and then we give them to the world and we give them to the Lord. And I think that's a beautiful image of the patience and the steady accompaniment that's needed in our ministry of hospitality. 6, hospitality is generous. It's indiscriminate. It's not just for a particular group of people. And I think one of our great American patron saints of hospitality is Servant of God Dorothy Day, who founded the Catholic Worker Movement that was predicated on this ministry of hospitality to serve the poorest of the poor. She said 2 quotes that really stick with me from this. One, I really only love God as much as I love the person I love the least, which really challenges us to really love our neighbor as ourself, even those who, and to love our enemies as Christ teaches us. And she says, the gospel takes away our right forever to discriminate between the deserving and the undeserving poor. And that really sticks with me, that it can be easy in parish communities to form natural cultures or sort of natural groupings. and to identify people who maybe don't fit into that group or wouldn't belong as easily. But as Christians, whether it's in our neighborhoods, our families, or our parishes, we lose the right to discriminate. That the joy of the gospel is called to be generous. It's meant for everybody. Christ's love is inclusive love, meant to include everyone, not exclusive love meant for only a privileged few. Seventh, qualities of hospitality. It's a ministry that's one by one. I think of Brother Solanus Casey, who is the porter or doorkeeper of the Capuchin Franciscan community in the United States. And his ministry was answering the bell at the monastery door. And he was sought after for people coming to receive advice and to talk with him, so much so that even though he held this very simple, relatively unimportant job in the life of the religious community, he's being lifted up on the pathway of sainthood. And so Solanus Casey didn't run a big evangelization program. He didn't have a website. Every person that came to him, he saw as Christ, as St. Paul talks about. Every person who came to him, he focused one-on-one to take the time to meet with them. And so I think in our ministries in the church, we can often focus on building programs and not building people. And to remember that the method of Jesus, of welcoming people and walking with them, is slow, it's steady, it's generous, and it happens one by one. Jesus called the disciples by name, one by one, and chose to walk with them. And so too, we're called in our parishes. Even amidst the many programs that are going on, all of those hopefully give us a chance to encounter people one-on-one. Eighth, quality of hospitality. It's not productive, meaning that it doesn't count a cost. It's not for the sake of something. So it seems counterintuitive because we know in our churches we want to welcome more people, we want our churches to grow, but that hospitality is not meant to use people as numbers to help our churches grow. There can certainly be a desire that's good to share that joy of the gospel with more people. But the goal of hospitality, in one sense, is not productive or not useful. It might sound silly to say it's useless, but useless not to mean it doesn't matter, but to mean that it's for its own sake. So liturgy is described this way. Liturgy isn't productive. Liturgy is like children at play when we gather in prayer to worship and give glory to God. It's for its own sake. We go to see the Grand Canyon or something beautiful, a beautiful painting, not to check a box because it's productive, but for its own sake. And in the same way, we welcome the stranger or those in need for their own sake, not on account of getting something. Mother Teresa says this beautifully when she says, we're not called to be successful, we're called to be faithful. And similarly, in the 20th century, I think of the wonderful musical Les Miserables. I love musicals and singing along in the car by myself. And there's a wonderful character in Les Mis, if you've seen that or know the music, of the bishop or the priest in the story who Jean Valjean escapes from prison and he finds shelter anywhere he can. And because he was a former prisoner, most people turn him away, but he goes to the church and this bishop welcomes him. But in the night, because he's so poor and hungry, he ends up stealing from the priest. And the police catch him. And the police bring him back to the church and say, Father, this person stole from you, which would have put Jean Valjean away for life. He would have had no future ever. And the priest looked him in the eye and he sings these beautiful lines. But he says, no, I gave all those things to this person. And he says, but my friend, you left so early. Surely something slipped your mind. You forgot I gave these also. Would you leave the best behind? And the priest grabs the silver candlesticks, the most expensive thing he has in the house, and he gives them to Jean Valjean, who had just stolen from him. And now most of us who like law and order and appreciate doing the right thing and justice would say, well, that wasn't right. He shouldn't have given them. He should have told the police the truth. But as the scriptures remind us, God says, your ways are not my ways, says the Lord. And as we had the year of mercy a few years ago, we're reminded to always see through the eyes of God. And this priest is this radical example of that even someone who stole from him, he has the heart and the eyes of the Lord to see the future of this person who would go on to do great good in the world and for others by being generous and giving the most expensive things that he had. And so hospitality is a ministry of generosity. It's not meant to be productive. Ninth, hospitality costs something. It's not free. So in the year 861, Saint Meinrad, who is a Benedictine, the same religious community as Saint Benedict that I quoted from earlier, Saint Meinrad welcomed some strangers in January in a very cold time And those strangers, realizing that he was alone, were able to steal from him. Except that he realized they realized he didn't have anything of value because he was a simple monk. And so they ended up killing St. Meinrad. St. Meinrad was also the doorkeeper at this time. And so although he didn't die defending his Christian faith, he died as a martyr of hospitality and was seen as a victim of offering hospitality. But this lesson either teaches us to harden our hearts to people and to say, we need to be more careful and protective, or with a Christian worldview teaches us that his life found its fulfillment in laying down for others, as Jesus calls us to welcome the stranger, even if it costs something of us. Now, hopefully, we're not putting ourselves in harm's way, and we have the right to defend our lives, especially those who we're entrusted to care for, like our families. But it should be a moment of reflection to say, how can I be more generous, and to lay my life down as Jesus did for the sake of other people, even if it costs something of me. And then finally, the last point of hospitality I'd like to share today is that hospitality always cultivates unity. We're certainly in a period of great divisiveness within our church and within our country. Certainly when we talk about many issues, whether it's pregnant mothers or immigrants, people sort of harden into their polarizing political categories and often don't have the language or opportunity to engage with one another or to be generous or joyful or healing or productive with one another. And I think it's important that we reflect on hospitality as a way forward in the life of the church for us to cultivate this spirit of unity. As Jesus prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane, he prayed that we might be one as Jesus and the Father are one. And certainly we know that we're not living out that unity that God calls us to very well in the life of the church, and maybe in the life of our particular parishes as well. I'm inspired by the spiritual writer Henry Nouwen, who talks about unity and hospitality. He says, every good relationship between two or more people creates space where strangers can enter and become friends. Good relationships are hospitable, even when we disagree. When we enter into a home and feel warmly welcomed, we realize that the love among those people who live in the home is what makes welcoming possible. So I worry that the spirit of divisiveness, not only in our country, but that's bled into our churches, is a great obstacle to this ministry of hospitality, warm hospitality, and evangelization to which we're called. Nouwen goes on to say, if there's a conflict in a home we walk into, the guest is forced to choose sides. Am I for her or am I for him? Do you agree with them or not? And that these questions prevent true, authentic hospitality, an opportunity for the stranger to feel safe and discover his or her own gifts. That hospitality is more than an expression of love for the guests. It's first and foremost an expression of love between the hosts. And so we go back to that question to the priest saying, I wouldn't want to go to church here if it were me. I think what he's saying is he hadn't cultivated in that parish community yet a spirit of warm hospitality where people could be welcomed. I know that there's a lot of zeal for people wanting to do street evangelization and go out and knock on doors, and that's very beautiful. But one question I would pose is, what are we inviting people to? Are we inviting people back to communities that are warm and welcoming and full of the joy of the gospel? Or if someone actually did come back to church during this time of coronavirus because they were spiritually hungry, would they find a church that felt isolated and where they would feel lonely and they would sense maybe some of this disunity in the life of our parish? We have to make sure that we have warm communities first so that we can more practically go out and share the joy of the gospel with others. So building on those 10 qualities of hospitality, I want to look to maybe some practical ideas in the life of our parishes that can cultivate this spirit of hospitality. And so I'll share 10 again, some personal and then some for our parishes. Starting with ourselves, because each of us are called to be Christian witnesses to hospitality in everyday life. The first thing I think we can do, and I want to be very practical in this time, is to think about where we sit in our churches. As one speaker I heard said, to keep in mind that everything we do at a church should be for the guest or for visitors. And so I know some people have a tendency to sort of sit on the end of a pew. Maybe that's your pew, for example. But there's this great line someone said, the end of the pew is not for you. That it's not very hospitable to sort of cap off the end of pews, to require people to sort of have to step or slide through you or over you just to find a seat. And so one maybe very small act of love or hospitality can be making sure there's always room for someone who maybe has to come in late with a young child or couldn't find a parking spot or something, to leave spot on the end for them to quietly or easily find a space. Not a big thing to do, but to keep in mind the end of the pew is not for you. Secondly, and this is probably the most important thing of my whole talk that I would share, get to know one new person by name every time you go to church. This can be a little challenging with social distancing and with masks, but I think it can still be possible for people to really cultivate a sense of personal relationships. And maybe it's when you're outside in the parking lot and people feel a bit more safe, even with a mask on, just to say, hi, I don't think we've met before. My name's Jonathan. What's your name? Or to find a quiet moment. I think even introverts can do this. Hospitality is not just an extrovert ministry. It's something we're all called to. But how powerful is it to get to know someone by name? And then maybe next week at the same Mass, when you see that person, to say, hi, Sandra, it's good to see you again. How are you doing? Knowing someone by name is how Jesus reached out to people. And it really does fill people with dignity and as though they're known. I know I'm terrible at remembering names, and that's sometimes something I have to work on, is trying to go out of my way to really practice giving people the dignity of being called by their name. Another thing we can do personally is to join in a ministry of evangelization or hospitality at our parish. Churches are always in need of more people willing to share that joy of the gospel, maybe on a Sunday morning or making phone calls to parishioners throughout the week, but to consider, if you're not already, to step up and ask the pastor, how can I cultivate a culture of hospitality in our parish and being willing to serve? If you're already one of those 10% of people who are very active, maybe you already have multiple hats active in your parish, my advice to you is to not serve more and take on even more hats, but to be really intentional about how you can steward other people's gifts and lift them up. And so consider mentoring someone in the parish to be a co-leader with you for a ministry. It can be easy, as we've done something for a long time, to do it the same way and to feel as though we have some authority or to hold tight the power we have in the parish. But I think the future of parish life and of our ministries is really being hospitable, even to people who want to share leadership with us. That both with clergy and laity, we're called to be co-responsible for the mission of the church together. And being hospitable is an opportunity to share that and to lift up and to welcome the gifts and experiences of other people. And that leads to sort of this theme of being a mentor in our daily lives, whether it's for people we're confirmation sponsors for or godparents. One thing we can always do is to really minister to the people who God has entrusted to us in our lives. And so think about your godchildren, think about the people you're sponsors for, think about your family members, your neighbors, the people in your phone book who maybe you haven't talked to in a while. God places specific people in each of our lives that we're called to reach out to. We can't wait for someone else or for the priest to try to reach out to that person. We can take some ownership there. And in the Synod on Young People, the Faith and Vocational Discernment that I was privileged to be a part of in 2018, Pope Francis ends up quoting in his post-synodal apostolic exhortation, Christ is alive, this phrase from young people talking about the qualities of a mentor. And I want to share that because I think these qualities of a spiritual mentor are very similar to the qualities of an effective hospitality leader or hospitable Catholic. Qualities of a mentor include a faithful Christian who engages both the church and the world, someone who constantly seeks holiness, who's a confidant without judgment, who actively listens to the needs of people and responds, who's deeply loving and self-aware, who acknowledges his or her limits and knows the joys and sorrows of the spiritual life, who's well-formed and engages in ongoing formation. So just a few of those qualities there, maybe to take one or two that stick out to you and think, how can I grow as a minister, a person of hospitality, both in my family life, in my community, and in my parish? Moving on to the context of our parish life, I want to share a handful of things that parishes can do to think about being more hospitable. And I want to be real practical here because I hope this talk isn't just something you sit through and roll your eyes or maybe take a couple of notes and then you put the notebook on the shelf. I hope it's something that stimulates a long-term plan to say, Father, we have to meet next month and talk about how we're going to actually put some of this into practice and enter into a period of discernment of what ideas stick out to us that we're called to. So for the parish, think first about your front door. And the front door of parishes today is online presence. It's your parish website and it's your parish presence on social media. Our Mass times on the front page, is there up-to-date information? Is it easy to to find people's phone numbers or faces of people you might be calling? Is there a nice video message from the pastor or a moment of welcome? Is ongoing communication ongoing in the life of the parish? If I register, is that the last time that I hear from the parish, or am I signed up for ongoing emails or text messages to keep me informed? Bulletins in some places aren't allowed, but bulletins are never the best place to share information. I mean, the joke says the best place to tell a secret is in the bulletin because so few people read it. But the bulletin, though it might be meaningful for some people, can't be the only way we communicate in our parishes. People are used to getting emails, texts, newsletters mailed, and we have to think of diverse ways to be hospitable and to reach out. So think about our online presence. And then secondly, to think about the other front door of the parish, your actual parish front door and curb appeal. Is the parish well signed? Are all the light bulbs working? Is it well lit? Are buildings labeled? Is there a banner outside the church saying masses are open, come on in? Are the doors of the church unlocked? And I remember when I was running a ministry in downtown DC, it started at 7 p.m. and I would get there at 6 to unlock the doors and go in and set everything up. And I would unlock the door but keep it closed because we weren't ready. I wasn't ready to welcome people yet at 6:30 or 7 when the program started. And every time I would unlock the side door, not even the big front doors of the church, and go in, I'd leave it unlocked. And there were, every single month that I held the program, there was at least 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 people who would go to that door and try it to come in just to see the church. The church looked closed. No doors were sitting open. It was 6 o'clock at night after people were leaving work. But people were spiritually hungry to find a spiritual home. And they just wanted a quiet place to go pray. And I think with so much insecurity in life, people are just hungry for another space to go to where they can feel safe and pray. And so I wonder if this could be a moment to keep our doors physically open more than we have. Maybe it's true for our parish offices as well. Maybe having the parish offices open from 9 to 5 when everyone else is working isn't the most hospitable thing. Maybe keeping parish offices or parish doors open till 6 or 7 o'clock at night gives people the chance to stop off on their way home from work and just have a quiet moment of prayer. Or to have an adoration chapel that has extended hours so people can come and sit in front of the Lord. So the first is to think about our curb appeal and the front door of our website. The second is that parish office that I mentioned. I've seen some parishes really find great success with having like a mobile parish office during their masses or some of their masses on Saturdays and Sundays. Again, if you're thinking of in the point of view of an organization, Sunday is the time when hundreds of people come. Monday through Friday, less active in the life of our church. Why not have parish registration forms available on Sunday, have a kiosk or a table where people can ask questions, figure out, what do I do to get a letter of good standing because I'm going to be a sponsor? When do I enroll in religious education? To have staff available on Sundays to encounter the people and to be hospitable, not only for parishioners, but also for newcomers who are there for the first time. I think during the week too, a very underrated person of hospitality in the parish is the parish secretary. And I think it's a real opportunity for us to really encourage and celebrate the parish secretary as a minister of hospitality and evangelization. They are the voice of the church for the world. And so one thing to look at is that voice welcoming and warm? I've heard some stories of parish secretaries that when people call to say they'd like to get married in the church, which is a great joy, the most exciting thing in that person's entire life. And praise God, they're wanting to have a sacramental wedding in the church. And the first thing a parish secretary says is, are you registered? Have you already enrolled in classes? As opposed to stopping and saying, congratulations, what's your fiance's name? How did he propose? Think of all the beautiful ways we can celebrate, like a warm home celebrates our brothers and sisters in that environment. The same is true could be true for funerals, how we can provide pastoral care over the phone. When someone calls just asking for a letter or a meeting with Father, instead of being overly administrative, sometimes we have an opportunity to welcome people and be hospitable in that moment. Even if the answer is no, we can find a warm way to listen to that person, to get to know them by name over the phone, and to help them find the right way to follow procedures. Third thing for parishes is to really assess your Sunday experience. And so again, walk through the parish as though you're a visitor, or encourage someone who hasn't been to the church to show up with you on Sunday and maybe even take some notes. We get so used to our churches, which is a good thing because we feel at home, that we forget that the other 90% maybe have a different experience. Maybe we're overlooking something because we know where everything is. We know where the broom is if someone spills something. We know who to find if there's an issue. We know where the bathrooms are. We know where the parish hall is. To really do sort of like an outside assessment of your parish to see how hospitable it is. I'd also encourage parish ministry leaders or hospitality leaders to go to a different parish, whether it's Catholic or non-Catholic, and experience how they're welcomed in a new environment. Sometimes we just have to be the vulnerable one who's new to experience like, oh, I didn't know where I was supposed to sit. I didn't know how communion went. I couldn't find the bathroom and I was there for 20 minutes. And then think, I wonder if people have the same experience as our church as well. I've heard of people having parish communication cards in the pews. So if someone's new, they can fill in their info, just their name and email and phone number, and just put it in the offertory. That way, it's not filling out a whole parish registration form, but it's just getting someone's basic info so that someone from the parish can make a personal touch to reach out and to build a relationship and to get to know someone. And in that context, it's easier to explain someone and to listen to someone about what they're looking for in the parish. It's not asking someone to fill out this long form before we even have a conversation. I think certainly from the pulpit, there are great ways at the beginning of Mass to get to know people by name or to welcome people. It's nice if someone says, please introduce yourselves to the people around you, or please greet everyone. But sometimes I think we can go a step further, whether it's to get to know people by name and ask, please introduce yourself by name to the person next to you, or please get to know the person by name so you can pray for them at Mass. And I think it's an opportunity for us to, again, focus on building personal relationships to get to know people by name. At the end of Mass, to sort of do an assessment of your parish announcements or in the bulletin of what's written. Sometimes parish announcements are written like this. RCA is at 7 o'clock at the Richard Jeszelinsky room. Please contact Brenda for more information. Well, I don't even know what RCIA is. I don't know where the Jeszelinsky room is. I don't know who Brenda is. We make it nearly impossible for people to take a first step even in joining the church in RCIA. That we have to really be aware of the inside baseball, inside lingo that we use in our parishes to make it really obvious, especially for newcomers, how people can engage. And at the end of Mass, to focus on availability. Again, COVID times make some of the guidance a little bit different, but the best ability, as they say in sports, is availability. We have to show up. And so are there people who can be available to answer questions safely? Are there people who can give advice or give information that's needed at the end of Mass, even just to be a warm hello? Unfortunately, all that whole job falls to a pastor at the end of Mass, who's the busiest person because hundreds of people walk right past the pastor as he's trying to say hello. That's not a great person to be able to answer questions that need a second moment. And then people kind of wait, maybe awkwardly, but there's so many more people coming that they just leave. I've done that so many times when I've been new and wanted to get to know someone or ask a question, but I just kind of feel awkward waiting and I just kind of leave. I think many people have that experience. But to know maybe the person who gives the announcement says, hi, I'm Jonathan. I'll be in the back of church if you have any questions. Please let me know. I look forward to meeting you. That can really warm people and give them the confidence they need to reach out and to ask a question. Other tips on the Sunday experience, think about your sight, sounds, smells, and signs to make sure there's nothing that's off-putting for someone who's new. And then just to think through all those, I love signage, that question of signage, thinking through, do people know where to go or what to do? There's so many things that people are just used to because they've been in the parish for years and years, but that a new person might not. Next point is to make the spiritual life accessible. Every parish will do this in their own particular way, but thinking about Mass times, event times, I've seen some parishes have a post-Mass prayer ministry where they make available a prayer team, if that's a part of your parish's charism, will pray over people by name after Mass. Again, a way that people can just feel the spiritual closeness of Christ, that touch of Christ, even on an ordinary Sunday. One big key of hospitality at the parish level is to prioritize parish touch points. And so I think there are a handful of touch points that are really important to start with to help change the culture of a parish. Focused on newly registered parishioners, including those who register for children's religious ed or the Catholic school, weddings, funerals, baptism preparation, RCIA, or if people request something from the parish, like a letter of good standing. All of these are moments for us to build a relationship with people. They're a moment for us to capture good data, like people's updated email addresses, so we can add them to email lists and we can stay in touch with them in the life of the parish. There are ways for us to provide pastoral care and for us to get to know people by name. And so think about ways, how can we be hospitable as though the people getting married are in our family? How are ways we can celebrate that? Maybe it's a handwritten card, or it's a bottle of champagne that the parish could buy, or some small cost-free token. How can we do the same for funerals or baptisms? Maybe it's starting a meal train service for the families who have lost a loved one, or for someone getting a child baptized. Ideally, we'd know when they have a child born, we can begin sending meals to them. We have to cultivate these types of relationships where we know people in that personal of a way. This next point is to connect people to affinity groups. So when someone does show up, let's say they register in the church, the question is then, what do we do with them? How do we walk with them on this ongoing way to provide ongoing spiritual accompaniment? And one thing I think is really helpful is to connect people into small communities where they might belong. And so maybe that's connecting them to people in the neighborhood. I've heard of some churches who have like neighborhood captains. So if someone moves into their neighborhood or registers to the parish because they're starting a Catholic school or religious ed, that person is the one who follows up with them. So it's someone down the street, not someone far away who they don't have anything in common with. It's connecting, when a new family registers, it's connecting that family to other families who go to the same high school, or other families who have similar interests. And again, we can't know that unless we maybe spend the time to get to know people better. A registration form can't tell us that someone's a huge Dallas Cowboys fan. And maybe there's another person in the parish who has season tickets. And there's just a chance to build a friendship or to build a connection. Or that two people happen to be accountants. It's a great way just to connect people who have something shared in common. And I think one thing that's important in this ministry of hospitality, though it's a bigger question than this talk, is thinking through discipleship pathways. So what are the different ways that we're going to walk with people in their journey of faith? I want to share one image that I think is important for this, which is the image of a house. So the ministry of the church welcomes people and walks with them closer in their missionary discipleship. And so the first thing to think of for the image of a home is the curb appeal. And that's this pre-evangelization. It's building trust with people. And then we want to walk with them up the sidewalk or the walkway to the front porch, that ministry of accompaniment where we're walking with people. The front porch is a place where we build touch points of parish life. And so maybe that's people coming to Sunday Mass. Maybe it's people just visiting the parish website. They're having an experience of the church, but you're not inside the house yet. There's not much of a commitment. But it's a way for us to engage and to form some relationship. Ultimately, if you have a visitor to your home, you invite them in the home. To the living room. The living room is that space of small community life. So maybe you have a small group program at your parish. Maybe it's connecting someone to parish ministries. So they sing in the choir or they join the food bank ministry. But it's a place where people can be known personally in a smaller group environment. And ultimately from that, in the context of small community life, they grow deeper in their commitment to the Eucharistic community to share a meal. That's long-term parish registration involvement at the dinner table. And when people are committed and connected to the dinner table of life and your parish, then you can begin to invite people who show leadership skills or who have different gifts and strengths in the parish to join you in the kitchen. That's missionary discipleship. So that's an example of a discipleship pathway that maybe the curb appeal is the parish website or parish social media. And someone gets connected there, but then you follow up with them and you invite them to come to RCIA or to a small group event. And then you invite people to become a registered member of the parish. And then you invite people to use their gifts and to volunteer for others. It's having a plan for how we connect people. Hospitality is not just a committee that works for 30 minutes on Sunday mornings before the masses. It's a vision and a culture of parish life that might include that pre-mass hospitality, but it doesn't end there. A couple more points. One, how do we change the culture by investing in our parish ministry leaders? As I said, our parish is full of small communities. We just don't call them that, right? The parish council is a small group. Parish finance council is a small group. The choir is a small group. The group of lectors might be a small group. The catechists who teach religious ed are a small group. If we could leverage personal relationships and friendship within those small communities, I think that 10% of people will be able to, in our church who are most active, will be able to grow. We'll be able to extend that to 11 or 12 or 13% because we formed these small communities to welcome new people. It's hard to welcome people in a group of 500 at church. And so we need to find smaller ways to connect people, to listen to people's stories and to get to know people by name. I think one little detail is to think about how we budget for being warm parishes. And so again, this isn't multi-thousand-dollar budgets that parishes may or may not have, but little things like, is it in the parish staff's budget or the pastor's budget to take people out for a cup of coffee? That when they meet people for RCIA or marriage prep, they can build a warm connection. I had one pastor who started, every time someone registered, he said, do you want to meet up at Starbucks and talk more? And he was shocked that 75% of the people who registered took him up on it. And so he said, I have to keep reloading my Starbucks gift card, but it's worth it. It's the best money I've spent, because people are spending 30, 40 minutes just talking to this priest about who they are, their hopes for the parish. And that person is someone who feels as though they belong to a warm church. And so whether it's the pastor, another staff person, maybe leaders on parish council or heads of different ministries, how do we create opportunities to build one-on-one relationships that cultivate warmth? And of course, a lot of this is focused on when people come to us in the parish. We always have to have a vision of going out to think about how we can engage people in our community. And so it's worth looking at our parish boundary to say, what are some of the particularities of our parish boundary? Who are we called to welcome? As my former pastor used to say, parish boundaries used to tell people where to go to church. And today they tell the church where to go to the people. And so maybe it is important to do some street evangelization, or to outreach to a local food bank or homeless shelter or college or high school in the area. That if our parishes have these different institutions, it cues us into the people that God has placed in our lives to reach out to. And certainly if a parish has 4 or 5 nursing homes in it, that hospitality is going to look different than if it has 2 or 3 middle schools in it. And so it's an opportunity for us to really engage hospitality to the audience, to the people that God's placed there. And then finally, in that vision of going out, we have to leave the parish property. I think the question that I ask myself is, how do we get to know people by name and to know that they're missed? I think young people especially are looking for authentic community. And if someone during this period of quarantine, of COVID, has gone 6 months and hasn't been back in church and no one's reached out to them, they begin to feel as though the church doesn't care about them, or they must not matter because no one cares. And this is the difference between a big box gym and like a CrossFit gym or yoga studio. That there's a great article in the Atlantic magazine from years ago called The Church of CrossFit. It talks about how when we form these smaller communities where people have individualized coaching, people are more likely to become engaged and to stay engaged for the long haul. And so I think too, we have to think about, do we have these big box churches where people come and go as they please, kind of anonymously? And how can we help them to feel as though they belong and known? And so sometimes parishes have had to start from scratch by just calling everyone in their parish database and spending hours and hours making hundreds of phone calls among a team. And that's really important work, because maybe we don't have updated email addresses. And that's a goal, to start capturing that so we can email people and reach out to them more, send out some surveys, invite them to a reopening for Mass. If we don't have that info, there's nothing we can do. But to make sure we're making these personal touches and personal outreaches to welcome people, to be a church that is radically hospitable, not because we're cool, because we've got the coolest screens in our churches and we have our pastor wears skinny jeans and looks cool and has a cool haircut. Those things might be valuable a little bit, but more important is people to find a spiritual home in our communities, a place that's warm, where they're known by name, where they're cared for, where they can rest up, where they're nourished and fed by the Eucharist, and where they're encouraged and sent on mission to be who they are and to be that well. I pray that this conversation cultivates a period of discernment in your parishes to live out that calling to hospitality in your own personal life and also in the life of your parish. God bless.